Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. Here at the Tenpenny Files, we dive into vital and often controversial topics for discussion that will challenge what you've been told and reveal what's been hidden. These compelling conversations will make you think, spark debate, and hopefully inspire action. Join me here each day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say but have often been silenced or censored. Today's conversation is with someone who really fits that bill. He's our special guest today is best-selling author Don Jeffries with his latest book, American Memory Hole: How the Court Historians Promote Disinformation, a powerful takedown of the myths we've been taught about the heroes and villains of American history. He claims that after reading this book, you will never look at our history books the same way again. Don, welcome so much to the Tenpenny Files. It's so good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to talk with you again. Thanks for having me.
And what I think thought would be because your books are so dense with well documented, well researched information. We could spend like a month just talking about this book, because I believe this is the third one in your series. So let's take a chronological walk through some of the information in your book of the American Memory Hole, and let's start with Thomas Jefferson's major clash with judicial review, centering on the landmark case of Marbury versus Madison that was way back in 1803. Jefferson strongly believed the Constitution did not give judges the right to overrule Congress. He argued that letting judges decide constitutional meaning would create a despotism of oligarchy. Jefferson lost, and ironically, the very system he opposed became defining feature of American government. And this ruling of more than 100 years ago, the way it's applied today, allows judges to stop Trump's decisions and legislate from the bench. Do I have that right?
Well, I mean, theoretically, it could allow, it's not any president's decisions, but the main point of contention, as Jefferson said, is that it gives the judiciary way too much power. And it upsets the balance of powers because, as he said, we never intended for some judge to be able to rule on whether something's constitutional. So
You know,
we have the legislature rule.
we got to adjust something because your voice sounds completely garbled.
Hmm. I haven't tried using the internal microphone. What is this? Oh, I got it. Well, I got to put it on that. Wait a minute. Uh, is that any better?
100%. What
Yeah.
did
Okay. And I'm not even saying anything. I'll just like this. I can hear now everything. Yeah, and it's ridiculous that I have this expensive microphone and I have to use my internal microphone, but it is what it is. If it sounds better, that's a good thing.
it's better, but it's still a little bit garbly.
Hmm. Let me see. I don't know. Uh, Let me see what I got the sound set on. Is it better if I turn up the volume? Is that better?
That's better. Uh-huh.
Okay. All right. I turned the volume up. Um, Not sure what else I can do. I don't know. I never know when this microphone is going to do this. It did it on when I was on Union on the Unwanted last week too. And ever since then, on my show and everything else, it's worked fine. So I don't know what's going on.
Well, that sounds better now, the way it is.
Good, good.
So I'll just start over again.
Okay, sorry.
Well, that's okay. We went to, I've been doing podcasting things now for about 6 years, and we went to pre-recording about 3 years ago just for this reason, to be able to
Yeah.
get it done right. So, and Patricia can just clip off the first, I will
Okay.
the first 4.5 minutes. So let me stop this. I have to start this over again. Okay, so I'll just start from the beginning again.
Okay.
Three, two, one. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny, And on the Tenpenny Files, we dive into vital and often controversial discussions on topics that will challenge what you've been told and reveal what's been hidden. These compelling conversations will make you think, spark debate, and hopefully inspire action. Join me here each day at 3 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday, to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say but have been silenced or censored. Today's conversation is with our special guest, best-selling author Don Jeffries, about his latest book, America Memory Hole: How the Court Historians Promote Disinformation, a powerful takedown of the myths you've been taught about the heroes and villains of American history. He claims that after you read this book, you will never look at American history the same way again. Don, welcome so much for being here with me today at the Tenpenny Files. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's wonderful to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
So let's take a chronological walk through some of the misinformation of your latest book, The American Memory Hole. And let's start with Thomas Jefferson's major clash with judicial review centered around the landmark case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Why don't you tell us what that constitution was debate about, and what was the end result, and how it even applies today?
Well, basically, it came to represent the first attempt at one of the branches. You know, Madison very famously created the three separate and equal branches, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. And his idea was that not too much power would be concentrated in any one place, and there would be checks and balances between them. And that was a great idea, I think. And Jefferson thought it was, but right in the beginning of the Republic, John Marshall, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he attempted to push it, and he pushed it in this case to where he wanted the judiciary to be able to interpret the Constitution. He wanted a judge, in this case him, to be able to interpret constitutional questions. And most Americans don't realize that at that time that was something that the founders never intended. Now the Federalists went along with it because the Federalists were like Marshall and Alexander Hamilton, you know, people like that I don't like. But people like Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, were outraged. And Jefferson, I think Jefferson's the last one to talk about judicial review until I started talking about it, to tell you the truth, because he lost so completely that it's most people don't understand it when I try to talk to them about it, because both sides are fine with judicial review, because the concept is, and you'll see it with Trump or anybody now, the idea is to try to get into court and get a sympathetic judge. Let's get a Judge Trump appointed. And that's not the way the system was intended to work, because, of course, you know, the other way it happens more often than not, where you get a judge who isn't sympathetic. It was appointed by, you know, Obama or Biden or something, and they do what we've seen them do, you know, some awful lawfare and things like that they have no business doing. And I point out to people, whether you believe in a constitutional republic or democracy, I mean, I think we're supposed to be a constitutional republic, but I like referendums, public referendums once in a while. That's pure democracy. So they were popular in the 80s and 90s, and you had Proposition 187 back in the early 90s, I think, that was would have solved the illegal immigration crisis, because it was a referendum that resolved illegal immigrants. If you're not here legally, you should not get any government benefits. And that's a very common sense thing. It passed overwhelmingly in a very different California. But what happened? It instantly went to a federal judge who was a liberal judge, and he just overturned it and said, no, it's unconstitutional. So all those millions of people that voted for that had their will thwarted because one unelected judge decided. And something's wrong with that system. And I can't convince enough people on the right to understand how bad this is. You know, they should not have judges have way too much power. The judiciary has way too much power. And what has happened is with the imperial presidents that we've had since Lincoln, really off and on, most of them have been imperial presidents. They've overstepped their boundaries. The legislature has taken a back seat. And if anything, that's the branch we should be most responsive to us, because theoretically we can overturn it every 2 years in the House at least. We don't, you know, we reelect 96% of them, but we could theoretically. And they just, I mean, they haven't declared war since World War II. And how many wars have we been in? And and that's their constitutional responsibility. And yet, you know, like Trump recently would just said, no, you know, I don't need, and he doesn't need to declare war because no other president has since World War II. And so it's nobody obeys the Constitution. And I try to write about it, but I think judicial review is a huge problem. And I hope more and more people are seeing it. I think Trump with all his travails with lawfare and everything, hopefully it opened up some eyes because you can see how prejudiced those jurors and what happened with the January 6th people. I mean, those judges were incredibly prejudiced against the defendants, and they just circumvented the law, and they didn't get fair trials.
You know, I've interviewed a couple of other people talking about this from a different angle, but about how what's supposed to happen in court is the judge is supposed to make a decision between the two people in front of him in the case. They're not supposed to make new law and adjudicate and do judgments and things like that from the bench. But they've gotten away with it. I mean, since Trump's first term, I mean, these little no-name judges and little courts in the middle of nowhere that nobody's ever heard of can say, I object, and it shuts down the whole government and shuts down
Yeah.
everything that's trying to happen. And like Trump or hate Trump, it's just wrong that they should be able to do that. Is there
Well,
anything that can be done about it short of going back to the 1803 law and trying to either revise it or overturn it?
Well, I would love to see them do that, but again, I don't expect that. Even Jeffersonians mostly don't really talk about that. I mean, I don't know. It's so instilled in the system. I guess it would be really hard to do at this point, but they can at least eliminate lawfare. And judicial review birthed lawfare, and nobody really knew what lawfare was until Trump entered office because he experienced it over and over again. And again, I'm a Trump agnostic, and I'm almost leaning away from. I'm very disappointed in his second term, but those were unfair trials and they set terrible precedents. And they were, the judges were incredibly biased, and they didn't even attempt to. I mean, you realize that in I think all his cases, but they just basically declared him guilty before the trial began. And the only thing that was to be heard was how much money are you going to pay us? And
Yeah.
there's something wrong with that. And we saw the same thing with Alex Jones. Alex Jones was declared guilty before the trial and said, well, the question is how much are you going to are these people going to be awarded? So what was the point of talking about a kangaroo trial? And so it's very disturbing to see that. And but I don't know what the answer is because the Republicans, I think, at least the worst of them, would probably do the same thing if they got a chance with the Democrats. And I'm not saying some of us might, kind of cheer to see some of these some of these awful Democrats on trial, but you have to have the rule of law. And in the case of with Trump, they set so many bad precedents in terms of uh, setting an award amount and not even having a guilt or innocence thing. And the E. Jean Carter case where the woman didn't even remember the year he supposedly sexually assaulted her. That case should have been thrown out by any judge. It doesn't matter who appointed him, but instead they let it go on and they found him guilty. I mean, she was if you read what she was really a fruitcake. I mean, she had severe mental problems and she couldn't even remember what year it happened. Yet he was found guilty of sexual assault. Same thing with I've had my real estate license for a long time. I still sell it on the side, and I've never met a homeowner anywhere that doesn't think his property is worth more than it is. I mean, everybody thinks, and Trump supposedly exaggerated his assets. And when did that become a crime? And the people that he supposedly, I don't know what he did to them, but they testified for him, the banks or whatever. So there was nobody wronged. And yet he was convicted and fined some outrageous, 200 million or some ridiculous amount. And everybody, because Trump is hated by so many, they cheered it on. Yeah, go get him. It's this. Get him for what? I mean, you might as well put him on trial for being, having a huge ego. I mean, that's not a crime. You can't do that. But some people would like to do that. So it's unfortunate, but it set a terrible precedent. And we're going to be revisiting in the future because they can always cite these cases. Well, there's or the vote fraud case, where they prosecuted him for in the same state where Stacey Abrams was continually saying that there was vote fraud. So now we can't allege that there was something wrong with our election. I mean, that's very dangerous, but we allowed it to happen. It's all because of Trump's personality, and so many people hate him. They were willing to let this stuff happen just to try to get him in some way.
So, for the sake of the audience, or the sake of the listeners, define lawfare. What does that mean
Well,
in generalities?
as I understand it, and it's basically politicized legal process that you're going after somebody because of the way they pretty much are opposite to you and the prosecution team. They like, for instance, Roger Stone was one of the first ones when they went after him. Roger Stone wrote the foreword to one of my books, so I know him. And they went after him, and he had Judge Amy Berman, who was just an awful, one of the most, typical Democrat biased judge. And in Roger Stone's case, he had the lawfare was so bad that basically prejudice, that the lead juror was caught on social media talking about the trial and talking about Roger Stone himself negatively. And that, if Stone had been charged with being a serial killer, in the old days they would have thrown that out because you can't do that. You can't have the juries are sequestered for a reason. In that case, Judge Berman refused to sanction her at all. She said she saw nothing wrong with it because she was engaging in lawfare and she hates Trump and she hated Roger Stone. And so you can't have that. I mean, there's a lot of these people I can't stand, Hillary Clinton and people like that. But I still, you still have to have some kind of process. You can't just hang them in the public square. But that's where we've come. But it all starts with judicial review because you give too much power to those judges, and especially when you can have a referendum or something, or you can have just legislation. It circumvents the will. So if the legislature passes a law, if they legalize marijuana or something, whatever, it goes to the right judge, they can, no, this is unconstitutional. There's something wrong with that. Because those are the representatives of the people that you elect, and one judge can overturn. I don't like that. But unfortunately, Republicans seem okay with it because their hope is that they're going to get in the right courtroom. And I don't think that's the way a free country should be working.
I agree with you. Well, let's move forward a little bit to the mid 1800s when you talked about the 11th president of the United States, James Polk, who you describe as the least known consequential president. And you said that he was he was the first president to really overstep his constitutional
Yeah.
powers. Explain and talk about that.
Yeah, I really no, I don't have an apology to Abe Lincoln, but I was a little rough on Abe in terms of crediting him with inventing a lot of it, which he did. But Polk started some of this stuff. Lincoln was the 16th president. The first 10 presidents,
Excellent.
um, they all pretty much understood that these are the boundaries we can't cross. They understood their duty, regardless of what they believed. The Adams and Jefferson and John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, they disagreed on a lot, but they didn't try to over. They weren't imperial presidents. Polk decided that he had the right to invade in Mexico, and as I described in the book, I was surprised to learn how many things that we would see in the Civil War, the kind of total war strategy where we would see all these rapes and all this theft where we would steal things and injuring, killing kids, terrible stuff that we see in so many wars. It's a part apparently of the U.S. military. It started in the U.S. Mexican War, and it left wounds that are still exist today with groups like La Raza, which is a very radical group. I don't like them, but they have a point because they believe we stole their land and they remember the atrocities that we committed. Now, of course, obviously it's an all long time ago and, 150 years or more, but still you can't counter that by saying we had a right to do that. So if you read my book about, and it's very familiar, if you read what I wrote about Lincoln and the Northern Army, it's the very same kind of thing where they committed atrocities on civilians. And up until, I don't know, other wars around the world, how often civilians were targeted. I get the sense they weren't as much as we have in America. And Lincoln refined it to an art under Sherman and Sheridan and all those people. I mean, they're the stuff I've described in my books is beyond almost belief. But it started to some degree in the U.S.-Mexican War. And again, that was so Polk. I have to rate him very lowly because he overstepped. He was the first one to cross the line and decide that he could do something that he really had no business doing. Wasn't our territory. It wasn't like Lincoln. I mean, it wasn't like Jefferson, who, bought the Louisiana territory and didn't go conquer anybody, he just expanded the land of the United States. We expanded it by, people that, much like we look at Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians, people are already there. So there's a problem when there's people already there. It's a little bit different. Same thing here. There were Mexicans and we were just trying to grab land and increase the land mass of the United States when we didn't do it like in Louisiana Purchase. So I think it left a lot of scars. And you see how many radical, Latino groups there are. You see them coming out raising the flag of La Raza and it's our land and all that. And they have a point somewhere. I don't know what you can do. We can't give it. What are we supposed to do? But at this point, we can't give California back, but it's our largest state. But um, it was just, I think, a needless thing. And if you look at the 10 presidents before him, and then the what 12, 13, 14, like four after him before Lincoln, they all were, I'm not saying they were great, but they didn't do anything really wrong in terms of their constitutional powers. They didn't try to usurp powers or do things they weren't, constitutionally sanctioned to do. And it wasn't until our boy Lincoln, that when he came, and the rest is history.
Oh, just for the listeners, so that you know, because you say that not many people. There's a lot of our presidents that we know nothing about. They fall
Mhm.
into these black holes of we know
Yeah.
about this one, about Jefferson, Madison, those things. But I just want to read this for the listeners that James Polk's presidency, which was from 1845 to 1849, he only ran once, said he wasn't going to run again, and he didn't. His presidency was associated with the acquisition of the Western lands, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and New Mexico. And I agree with you. When my mother-in-law was still alive, she was really involved in a lot of Reagan presidency things in California because she had a whole program for teaching illiterate prisoners how to read because she assumed this position of one of the reasons that people default to crime is because they can't integrate into society because they're illiterate. And if they could read, that things would, be able to change for them. And she told a story many times about being at Reagan events and having people come up and saying, "This is our land, and we're taking it back one of these days." And that would have been in the 80s, maybe in the late
Mhm.
70s. So, I hear with you with what you're saying about the acquisition of that land and why it still cantankerous. So let's move on to Lincoln because you and I've had conversations before, and the first time that I talked to you about one of your other books, and what you said about Lincoln just blew me away because as Lincoln served in the mid 1860s, most Americans consider him a hero for preserving the
Yes.
country during Civil War. But explain why you think Abraham Lincoln was our greatest tyrant.
Well, again, he built on what Polk did, and Polk crossed the line, but Lincoln crossed just a line that completely destroyed the America that existed before. As I've told people, in 1861, the United States were referred. That's how powerful the individual states were. When Lincoln decided that, and you hear, if you look at, I put it in my other book, I think Lincoln very was right about the U.S. Mexican War. And he was a Republican, Polk was a Democrat, so it was a partisan thing. But what he said about that, we shouldn't be doing this, we shouldn't be meddling over there. Exactly, that they have a right to. And the exact same kind of thing could be said about what he was trying to do in terms of the Civil War. But if he had just simply he had a sense of history, and he knew that America was born from seceding. We seceded from British rule, so that was the secessionist movement, and we had to fight because the British didn't want to let us go peacefully. So that was the way our country was born. We were born on the right, and the founding principle of the American Revolution was that people everywhere have a right to consent to those who govern. That's a radical concept. The consent to the governed. I learned that in school. They probably don't teach it anymore. But what happened, Lincoln overturned the central concept of the revolution on its head because clearly those southern states no longer consented. So he had no right to hold them by force. There's nothing in the Constitution that said, these states can never leave, that they have to stay. Obviously, and the Articles of Confederation, especially before that, which a lot of people think were better, certainly would have been appalled by that. But Lincoln had the notion that this was, and he's the first one that started talking about the sacred union. Before Lincoln, I don't know how many references there are to the Union. And in fact, more often they refer to it as a confederation, which is odd because the Confederates took their name as a reason because historically they call it the Articles of Confederation, which was our original government, and most people think we're better than the Constitution with states' rights. And so they had a historic reason for doing that. But I've pointed out what I've learned about Lincoln studying him is how much he hated the founding fathers, especially Jefferson. He really hated Jefferson. with a real vitriol. And I've got all kinds of quotes from the people that work with him and everything in my books. And so he wasn't on board with what the founding fathers wanted to do. He wasn't for a limited government. He wasn't for the consent of the governed. He was for this mystical union thing, which I don't even know what it meant, but he referred to it constantly. I have to save the union. And that, again, look back before that. Nobody really referred to it as the union. You could have said maybe save the states or something, but no, save the union. And when he made the move, when he could have just left. It was only 7 states that seceded originally. They would not have been able to put up a credible fight, and they would have probably just come back with their tail between their legs after a short period of time. They wouldn't have been able to make it in the same landmass, I don't think. So that's what I think a good leader would have done. He said, oh, yeah, go ahead, see what happens. And but no, he instantly, you can't do this. And he invoked all kinds of eventually he would evoke God, which he didn't really even believe in God. That's what all the evidence shows. But instead he used him, that this is God's will. It's that almost 1 million people die. No, I think it's your will, Lincoln, because you're the one that was pushing this thing. But if he had just simply let that happen, then you wouldn't have. But instead, he invaded Baltimore, he arrested the mayor and all that, and that's what caused the other 6 states, including Virginia and Robert E. Lee, who was, he was no radical Confederate, and the only reason he joined, and in fact, he would have been the leader of the Union Army because he was a much better soldier than Grant, who was a drunk and had no strategy at all other than getting his men killed. He was a war of attrition, but Lee was a great man, and but he was loyal to his state. He said, my state comes first, so I'm with Virginia. They seceded, so I'm with them. So and he was asked to lead the Union. That's it was because of people like Lee and Jackson. I don't know much about the military, but Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Jeff Stewart, and people like that. They had really great generals, where the Union had none really, other than McClellan, who Lincoln kept making fun of and trying to get out of there because McClellan was the only one who didn't want to get his men killed constantly. And that's what was so bad about the war. In fact, Lincoln's own wife called U.S. Grant Butcher Grant and said he's trying to win a war of attrition. And that was their entire strategy, and Lincoln pushed it. We have way more men than they do. Just rush head for it, and we'll win because we'll overpower them. Yeah, a lot of us will die, but McClellan was a real military man, and he said, I'm not going to do that. And that's why they clashed. But you look at the court historians today, and the record shows that McClellan was the man who had a conscience and didn't want to get all his men killed. I mean, that's, I think, the first thing any good military leader should desire, should not get your men killed. But Lincoln was no military leader, and he had this guy Sherman, who was a certifiable psychopath. Sheridan wasn't far behind him, so they would do what he wanted to do, and they were willing to rush willy-nilly in there and get tons of men. Grant, of course, too, and that's how they won the war. And if they had had military men, they would have won much earlier because they had a decided advantage in numbers, but they were being fought by people like Lee and Jackson, especially, who were just brilliant strategists, and they were able to hold their own for a long time. But just a very sad story, and so many things came out of that. And Lincoln's actions during, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, it's an unprecedented move, kind of shutting down over 200 newspapers. This is the stuff he did. Most people don't understand. He did that, and just transforming the way we looked at America again, shattering the consent of the governed, so that, and we became a new country. But some people call it the Second American Revolution, and it was. But it was a revolution that overthrew the first one. It overthrew our war for independence. So at the end of the war, 1865, now was the United States is. Never plural again, because now it was one union, one inviolate union, as he described it. And we've never been the same. And Lincoln set so many bad precedents for what he did. I mean, we still don't know how many thousands of people in the North he rounded up and threw into prisons, including, as I said, ironically, for the grandson of Francis Scott Key, Frank Key Howard, who was thrown in the same prison where his grandfather looked out and wrote the Star Spangled Banner from. I mean, can you imagine the irony? And Lincoln, do you think, how many Americans do you think know that? Lincoln threw him in prison just because he criticized his policies. These were not Confederates. These were people that say, this is ridiculous. We're getting too many men killed. Why are we doing this? Lincoln would not talk. He would not negotiate at all. The Confederates kept wanting to talk. They would send diplomats, and Lincoln said no. He just was steadfast. He's the opposite of everything most Americans think he was. He was unreasonable. He was a bloodthirsty warmonger. He was certainly not a man of peace. Most people think he was walking around looking all sad and melancholy, and he was depressed. But he also was taking like mercury or something. His wonder didn't kill him, at the time because he had mental problems, and his wife was probably, disturbed as well. So but we don't know I don't know what his presidency would have been like other than that, because the entire thing was about the war, which he pushed. But at the end of it, when you had, I mean, Lincoln did things like, they hanged the commandant of Andersonville prison, which would pave the way for the Nuremberg trials later, which I think was another awful miscarriage of justice. But that was the first time where they hanged, after you surrender in wartime, you hand over your sword. Well, okay, you go your separate ways, and what if you've gotten land, you do, but you don't keep fighting. You don't punitively punish people. But Lincoln got the ball rolling. He hung the commander of Andersonville prison, who, by all accounts, was a good man, including the prisoners there. They didn't, because of Sherman. Sherman was running through the total war strategy in Sheridan. They were burning all the crops, but they weren't raping the women. They had no food to eat, and the women and children had no food to eat. How were they supposed to be able to feed Union prisoners? And again, this people don't know. They tried repeatedly to make a deal with Grant, the Confederate generals. Let's trade prisoners. He wouldn't do it. And then they got so fed up, they said, well, here, just take your prisoners. You don't have to give us ours back. And they wouldn't do that. And then they just released Union prisoners in Florida. And Grant rounded them up and gave them back to the Confederates. So, I mean, how many Americans do you think know that?
Not very
They were
many,
the
but
good guys.
that thought right there, Don,
Hmm.
because this is really important information and really compelling and really edgy, which I love about when I talk to you about your books. So hold on right there. We're going to take a quick break from our sponsors from AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the Tenpenny Files on iHeartRadio Network daily, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. The next day, the Tenpenny Files can be heard on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes, iHeart Virtual Studios, and on my own platforms at drtenpenny.com and drtenpenny.substack.com. You can also listen to any of these shows from anywhere in the world by America Out Loud .news media player, because there's so many great books and so many documentaries. This show is meant to jumpstart your interest. We've got a special message coming from our sponsors that keep us going here on iHeartRadio and America Out Loud .news. Sit tight. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking to Don Jeffries about his latest book, The American Memory Hole: How the Court Historians Promote Disinformation, a powerful takedown of the myths that we taught about our heroes and villains. And we've already talked about three amazing things that you will read about in this book. But let me tell you a little bit more about Don Jeffries for those that are not familiar with his work. Donald Jeffries is a truth teller in an age of so-called official narratives. A respected historian and fearless podcast host, Don Jeffries is a prolific writer and an investigative journalist we have been following for years. He is best known for his investigations into the assassination of JFK, which leads me into the next part of our discussion here, Don. Let's keep walking through history. How does JFK's life and his 1963 assassination matter now more than ever?
Well, I was talking about this last week on the show, but I think that for the baby boomer generation, the Kennedy assassination was our seminal moment. Much like the millennials have 9/11, and it was something that we all remember. I was 7 when he was killed, and as a little kid, it's some of my first memories are that, of seeing my parents, because we were a Catholic family, seeing my parents crying and for the first time really, and hearing my dad talk about Johnson did it. And so I was steeped in this as a little kid, and so I never for 1 second thought Oswald did it, As a 7-year-old, I saw Jack Ruby kill Oswald, and I said, well, he shot him. Obviously, to shut him up. I mean, as a 7-year-old, I can understand that. But so for so many people, and people that were older than me, that were teenagers, that were or even young adults who were inspired by JFK was the last idealist to be in the White House. He created something like the Peace that were inspired by to join the Peace Corps. Let's go over whatever some other country and try to help people out. And that it was such a shock to see, and not to mention the fact he was the first movie star president. I mean, he looked like a movie star. He he was had his elegant wife. They weren't used to seeing young people. And Jackie Kennedy was, I think, only 30 when they were elected. So she was like, the youngest first lady other than Grover Cleveland's. But um, so this was, and they had elegance about them. They tete-a-tete with movie stars and so forth. And I think the cultural shock of seeing him die like that when he was the youngest president ever elected so suddenly, and replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who was just the opposite, the polar opposite, this gruff, kind of ignorant sounding, awkward, career hack party politician who couldn't begin to, he would pass some legislation that JFK had, but symbolically, I think that the people were affected so much by the transition from JFK to LBJ. And I've said over and over again, it's so important because for our generation, that's when the conspiracy, I mean, you see my books goes way back, obviously, to the beginning of the Republic. But for most people today, we can start at the JFK assassination. In my first book, Hidden History, that's where I did. I started at the JFK assassination because people can understand that one and they can see, I mean, just look at what happened as a result of his assassination. We know from the National Security Action Memorandum that he was going to get out of Vietnam. He had already said we're going to have the first 1,000 out by the end of 63 and all troops out by 65. So that changed immediately after his death. So Vietnam, there would have been no Vietnam War. There would have been no anti-war protest because there wouldn't have been a war. There probably wouldn't have been a counterculture. There may not have been any drug thing there would because the counterculture was built on that. There may not have been free love and all that, the sexual revolution. I don't know if any of that would have happened. Maybe, but I doubt it. I think it was all in response to JFK's death. And I've said many times on November 22nd, 1963, if you took a charter graph and you try to trace American influence, financial influence or economic influence at home and abroad, cultural and everything, I think America was at its peak on November 22nd, 1963. And I think ever since then, it was a steady line down, if you had a graph like that. So is that he was replaced by this person who couldn't possibly replace him, and everybody knew it. It was, like I said, it was such a shock, like cold water thrown in your face. And to not have it, even though again, Americans weren't, before that, it's true. They really trusted the government before that. Pearl Harbor and all that stuff. Nobody was listening to the few conspiracy theories that were around then. But when Jack Ruby shot Oswald, it was so obvious. It was so obvious, and their explanation was completely ridiculous, and nobody bought it. Even for the American people were very innocent. They tended to trust their institutions, but I think it was the death of innocence. I don't think that's cliche to say that because that was the beginning of distrust in government. That was the beginning, certainly of the left, the anti-war movement, but that was a result because Kennedy didn't get to end the war, which he would have done. But you can even look at in 1967, the famous CIA memo countering criticism of the Warren Report. That's where the term conspiracy theorist came from. It was the first time it was used, and it's used all the time now for everything. So just, if you're questioning something, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. That comes from the CIA memo, and it came from the JFK assassination as a result of that. I don't think RFK would have been assassinated if JFK hadn't been. I don't think you would have had Chappaquiddick with Ted Kennedy. Probably wouldn't have had Watergate because Nixon wouldn't have been president. The entire history would have been completely different. I don't know what it would have been like. I think it would have been better, but we wouldn't have had all the contention and the assassinations of the 60s. So I think we have to look at that event, the fact that it wasn't, and if you watched, very disappointing, ABC had a new special the other day that came out again. They haven't done one for a while, and they haven't changed. I mean, just they won't give it up. I mean, it was so bad. And now at the point, I just sit there and I say, God, I mean, they find people, and I know so much about this subject, and there's lots of other people that do, and I have to sit there and listen to these people that know nothing, and they're either lying or they're uninformed. And they had Oliver Stone and my friend Jim DiEugenio, who were on Jefferson Morley, who also know, but they were given almost no time. Half the show was by this guy that I used to get in arguments with on the forums back in the early days, who is now, because he says Oswald did it, he's welcome on TV. I'd be welcome there too if I suddenly said Oswald did. Hey, come on, you want to come on the ABC special? That they're pushing that, even though still the majority of the people, it's not as much as it was, but back to the 1960s, 80, 90% of the American people then thought there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. So nobody's bought it. But through the why it matters with Kennedy too is because then you have the second assassination of JFK's character, which happened with Judith Campbell Exner came out of the woodwork in 1975, and her story I've talked about in my books. She wasn't credible in the least, but they bought what she said right away, and they began attacking JFK. I watched that special on ABC, same old stuff. They talked about how there was a cover up at his autopsy because the Kennedy family didn't want people to know he had Addison's disease. This is nonsense. I've seen the documents where RFK Jr. signed a form that said no restrictions. There were no restrictions on the autopsy. They just didn't do a good autopsy because that people weren't qualified to do it. But they continue to throw these lies out, much as you have the Secret Service agents that were still alive until a couple of years ago, continue to come out and basically blame him for his own deaths when they didn't protect him. So it's a huge issue, and it does connect. There's a domino effect because the JFK assassination again goes into Vietnam, goes into RFK, uh, Chappaquiddick, all that stuff, all the way through Watergate and through JFK Jr. I was the first one to talk about his assassination. He wouldn't have been assassinated because none of the other Kennedys, even RFK Jr. today, where we see where his hands are shackled and tied because they know what he is and what he's saying. He's publicly saying the government, he's not saying it much lately, but it was saying that the government killed his uncle and his father. So I write a lot about the Kennedys. I think the Kennedy family is very important, and they're kind of an opposition power for a while there. And unfortunately, they got rid of most of them. And it's, but yeah, the JFK assassinations, and most young people who are obviously born way after he was killed, they still get it. They understand. None of them believe that, that it wasn't a conspiracy because they're now steeped in conspiratorial thinking. They have 9/11, electoral fraud, and all the stuff that's happened in recent years. And so they can believe that, obviously.
You
So you don't
know,
have to explain it to them as much. It's the older people that don't get it.
it's one of the things that, my prayer list every day is Bobby Kennedy. I know Bobby, I've known him for probably 15 years, and I pray every day for his wisdom and his safety because of the things that have happened to his family. So every day it's like, Lord, protect him. He's swimming in a bunch in a pond with a bunch of angry, rabid alligators, and he's got barely a stick to beat him off with. And he's, I say, and I say a lot of times, and he's got a little bit of a family history there. You mentioned that JFK Jr.'s death in 1999 was, and you view it as an assassination and a political takedown. And I want to couple that in with Charlie Kirk's very public assassination. That I've heard people refer to his assassination and death to kind of be this generation's Kennedy assassination of what in 1963, how it kind of affected, like you said, all the history of American history. But all of us that are alive and remember that, during that time, it was on the day, where were you the day Kennedy got assassinated?
Yeah.
Just like, where were you on 9/11, that you never forget that either. And those people
Yeah.
from 2001, I mean, there's a whole generation that was born after that. And so these things, really kind of tie that together about RFK Jr.'s death and Charlie Kirk's death, and where do you think we're going from here?
Well, I think the Charlie Kirk death again. I don't know how significant it was as opposed because he wasn't a politician. He was a young guy that had a big following. But um, the explanation, the official story is ridiculous. And again, there were many parallels to the JFK assassination. I've studied it enough. I wrote about it, where again he is seen going back and to the left, ironically, like JFK, and he's seen like going to the side and not really to the back. And we're told that this guy was shooting on a rooftop, and he was shooting pretty much straight on, so he probably should have gone straight back like that. That should have been the reaction to a shot from there. But the guy they found, oh, what the guy's, I can't remember his name now, but and they're going to convict him of this. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. This guy, their story is that he had a German Mauser, which is a very powerful gun, and most people that know guns say that if he had used that, it would have probably blown Charlie Kirk's head off. It would have made much more than the small little hole that we saw. And so I don't think that could have been the gun. And it's very hard, if not impossible, to disassemble quickly. And we're told that he, assembled it on the rooftop, then disassembled it and assembled it again. I don't know, after jumping. It's just the whole thing makes no sense. Put it in a box to be found in the woods. Just incredibly stupid stuff. And then later he's photographed, I think, in a McDonald's or some fast food place. And then he has the transgender boyfriend who's largely disappeared down the memory hole now. I don't know what happened to that guy. He was supposedly going to testify against him. You had that whole thing in there. And you have the fact that Charlie Kirk had no security, only a handful of security people, much as we saw with JFK, much as we saw with Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, where the security, they didn't do the job. They let it happen. And in this case, they don't seem to have responded very well. There was no ambulance there. And so we're supposed to believe that he was carried, although the footage shows no trail of blood. Again, it just doesn't. You can conclude what you want from that, but he was supposedly carried to an SUV. That just seems like an odd way to me, there should have been, they have in high school football games, they have ambulances. I don't know why there wouldn't have been one there, especially Charlie Kirk was putting himself out there. That's why people weren't surprised because he's got these often hostile college students coming up, and the whole thing is to argue. So I don't think it was that much of a shock, really, to think that one of them might take a pot shot at him or at least, physically attack him or something. So they should have known that. So why wouldn't you have those kind of precautions? They didn't. And then you have the things like his chief of staff or something that is seen on the phone and kind of acting disinterested right afterwards. Candace Owens has done a great job on this. And that's the difference with JFK and something like this is that with the internet and somebody like Candace Owens, who's a real journalist and was kind of a mainstream conservative until Ben Shapiro turned her into David Duke Jr., where she can't get off the subject of it. She's doing lots of good work. And Charlie Kirk was her friend, and she's done a great job of exposing how absurd this official story is. And then you throw in the behavior of the widow, Erica Kirk, and it is what it is. I'm not gonna, but I mean, it's very strange. I think if you just look at her, you get Tammy Faye Baker vibes. It just doesn't seem sincere. I don't want to say it just, and then recently they had the thing with J.D. Vance where she would said I'll get in more trouble if I grab J.D. Vance's ass or something. Just inappropriate stuff. I don't even understand what she's doing. And she just seems to be too happy. And so I don't, and she's not asking any questions about what happened either. And I think that's what I would be doing if it was my spouse, because this is a ridiculous explanation. This makes no sense. This guy obviously didn't do it. So, who did? And then, of course, you have the Zionist element, and that's where Zionism has become the most important topic today. And it's Charlie Kirk really, his death really made it go through the roof because, Candace Owens released those texts, his last text that said, "Hey, I've had it with Israel. I can't, I can't deal with this anymore. All the old stereotypes there, they're pressuring me. I'm changing my stance." It's very clear that, so if I'm investigating that case and I'm looking, okay, I'm Sherlock Holmes and I'm saying, okay, what changed in his life? Well, only one thing changed, and that was his stance towards Israel. And he's recorded talking to Megyn Kelly and other people too about how many times he's been threatened, and then he's getting tired of it, and that he doesn't want to take more money from Benjamin Netanyahu because he'll feel betrothed to him, and he's talked about all this. So to me, that's what I would look first. And of course, oh, you're saying the Jews killed him. I'm just saying it looks like that there's some kind of a connection there because that's what changed in his life, and you have the people that the Turning Point USA that are just really going crazy about saying like, don't ask any questions about it. It's like everything else. They don't want you to ask any questions about this stuff. And if we have a free country and they have nothing to hide, we should be able to question it. We should. As far as I know, Charlie Kirk either didn't have an autopsy, which is required in that state for a gunshot victim, or they just haven't released it. Again, JFK assassination, as bad as that was, we knew the results. They released the information about the autopsy. They didn't release the photos, but we knew that early on. The critics knew it. Why don't we know it about him? So I think there's lots of questions to ask, and it's important because it is really, you got social media, you got people on the alt media is really taking after this one, and again it kind of is mixing in with the whole criticism of Zionism. So I think it's great, and I hope that Candace Owens and the others don't let go of it.
Oh, she is the one keeping it alive. It seems to be like a something in the rearview mirror for most of the rest of the, mainstream media, the politicians, for everybody. It's just sort of
Yeah.
she's the one that is keeping it alive, and I hope that someday somebody will really get to the bottom of it. Speaking of getting to the bottom of it, you cover so, and we've only got a few minutes left in our time here together today, Don. But you have so much in your books and your other books, setting the record straight for the American people. Why is this and your other books so important, and why should they be in every American's library and really read to know the truth about our country and our government?
Well, I'm not all my books are history books of one kind or other. I wrote a book about Hollywood that's historical, and my
Mhm.
book about the economy, Survival of the Richest, has a lot to do with economic history. But yeah, my series of hidden history books, which are three of them, American Memory Holes is the third one. People, if you don't know your history, you're condemned to repeat it. They said, and the past is prologue, and I think we're in the situation we're in because people don't. They're Americans are historically illiterate. They don't know these things. What the stuff I'm writing or talking about, most people have no idea about this. They're taught so superficially in school. They're taught, Lincoln was a great man. He freed the slaves. That's about it. Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus. I mean, it's so superficial. You almost know the World War II was a great war. We beat the Nazis. Holocaust. That's it's so little sound bites. Nobody does any digging. Nobody knows anything beyond that. Eventually, when they get Trump in the history books, it'll just probably be that Trump was horrible and insane. That's it. And so nobody does any real investigation and digs deeper into it. And so what do the facts say? And that's why I talk about court historians, and I talk a lot about Harry Elmer Barnes, who invented that term. And he was a classical liberal back in the 1920s who was thrown out of polite society. He was published by all the biggest periodicals when he went against World War One. And he said, "Why are we fighting this? It's stupid." And no, no, you're not welcome here anymore. And then I talk about in the book, FDR invented cancel culture. He was the first one to do that. He got lots of people fired. The America First movement, he was calling newspapers and radio saying, "Hey, you can't have this guy on anymore." He ruined careers. But Harry Elmer Barnes talked about he wanted his goal was to bring history into accord with the facts. And that's all I'm trying to do is to try to bring it into accord with the facts. Because we can't know everything. Some of this stuff is hard to know. But I tell people I don't know half the time what really happened to anything. I'm just trying to tell you you're being lied to all the time. And what they tell you didn't happen. That's all we can be sure of is that they're lying about it.
That really sums it up. Where's the best place that they can go to get your books, Don? The American Memory Hole, How the Court Historians Promoted Disinformation. Where's the best place to get it? And tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, well, you can get on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and any of the places. My books are available. I tell people just to get the best deal they can. And Substack is where I push that because I write regularly there, so you can keep up with me. It's donaldjeffries.substack.com, and that's called I Protest, which is the same name I use for my podcast. And that's every Friday, live streams on my YouTube channel from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern. And so they're kind of companion pieces. But, so I keep people, up to date and commenting on current events and things like that and my take on things. But my books are out there. Obviously, there's more historical pieces, but I appreciate people reading them, and suggest it to your library. If you don't want to buy it, I understand. The books are expensive. Have your library buy it for you. I get a sale either way, and it'll get in the hands of more people. So, uh, but people can subscribe to me in Substack. That's the best way to support me.
And tell them what your Substack address is again.
donaldjeffries.substack.com, and it's I Protest.
And do you write daily there?
No, not daily. I write. It's up in a couple times a week because my articles are pretty lengthy. So and nobody's complained that I'm not writing enough. So it's usually a couple times a week. It seems like about every 4 or 5 days, 5, 6 days. So I wrote one yesterday, I think it was. So
Oh, very good, Don. Thank you so much for being with us again. Thank you for all of your hard work, all your digging into all this and the reference material and all this. And I just always, every time I have a conversation with you, my eyeballs just blink open. It's like, wow, I didn't know that. And there's just so much that you talk about that people just don't know about that they really should know about. So it's really important for you to be here. And you're right, we get lied to about everything, and whether it's science and vaccines and drugs and or in glyphosate and all the there's just everything that's just twisted. And thankfully, we've got investigative journalists like you that are trying to dig out the facts and dig out the truth for us. So I want to thank you again for that. I want to thank everybody for joining us here again today at the Tenpenny Files. And with that, I'm going to close out with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all of my podcasts with, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Lean into God who will never let you down. We'll see you again the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on AmericaOutloud.news and iHeartRadio. The shows are then uploaded to your favorite podcast platforms, including your favorite website, which is my website, dr10penny.com. There's a whole place up there for you to follow it. We have a new site now. It's dr10penny.com/guides /guide that will tell you what shows that we're doing throughout the week so you can plan accordingly. But then again, if you've missed anything, you can find them on our Substack, dr10penny.com, which comes out on Saturday, and dr10penny, it's 10 Penny Walk with God.substack.com that comes out on Sunday. So have a great day, everyone. Have the great rest of your day. We'll see you again here next time, same place, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern on the Tenpenny Files on iHeartRadio and AmericaOutloud.news. Have a great day, everybody. Goodbye and God bless.